Hi everyone, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on changing masculinities, challenging norms. It's Sandy Ruxton here with my co-host Stephen Burrell, as always. So, how are you doing, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Sandy. But it has been highly distressing to follow the kind of developments in the Jeffrey Epstein case recently, which has really been showing, so many wealthy, powerful men either actively involved in or kind of complicit in the systemic sexual abuse of girls and women, and also how a kind of great deal of the media coverage about this has focused primarily on the ramifications of this for the kind of these high-profile men, rather than telling the stories of the victim survivors. But yeah, how are you doing, Sandy?
Well, yes, today we're going to be talking about the prevention of men's violence against women, so obviously this is all very relevant, as is the fact that Giselle Pellicot has just given a powerful interview to the BBC about the sickening crimes she was subjected to over many years by her husband and at least 50 men. I think it's probably 70 or 80, but about 30 of them haven't been found. Her book, A Hymn to Life, Shame Has to Change Sides, has just been published in the UK, and the interview is on BBC iPlayer. And in conjunction with this, I also went recently to see feminist philosopher Manon Garcia talking about her important book, Living with Men, which analyses the trial and the entrenchment of rape culture in France and I think elsewhere, and asks what is to be done in these dark times. So this is definitely something we should discuss further in future episodes, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But for today, our guest is Landon Kenney. So Landon is coming to us from Ontario in Canada, where he works as the Male Allies Program Coordinator for the Sexual Assault Support Centre of the Waterloo Region, which we may refer to as SASC at times, for ease during the podcast. Welcome to Now and Men, Landon. You're the first Canadian we've ever had on the show.
It's very exciting to be here. I'm very grateful. Thank you for having me. I didn't know I was pioneering new ground, but it is exciting. Yeah. We're representing a true kind of Commonwealth experience between the three of us.
Absolutely. So perhaps to start off with, could you just tell us a little bit about the kind of Male Allies program that you run? What are some of the different types of work that this involves? What does the content of your workshops look like?
Yeah, of course. So we offer a pretty wide variety of programming because we try to program to many different kinds of ages. Mm-hmm. So when I first joined the agency, I helped to develop programming around, conversations of consent, anatomy, boundaries, things like that for children in 6 to 8 years old, grades 1 through 3. That kind of those focuses are a large makeup of the work that we do. It is a lot of conversations around consent. As we get to, older groups, we start integrating more conversations around, sexual violence prevention kind of more explicitly, but lots of conversations around authentic consent, healthier relationships. And then my program, as kind of part of that public education team that I'm on, the Male Allies program, specifically looks at engaging men in a variety of different spaces and ages in conversations around masculinity, alternatives to kind of the standard patriarchal masculinity and messaging that they have received their entire lives, and a large focus on allyship, on how to use the kinds of privileges and roles that society has bestowed upon us as men in order to help create safer, healthier communities. The organization's goal is always to support and listen to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. We continue that mission not only through the listening to all survivors, but also in engaging men in those conversations on what they can do for survivors in their lives and kind of as a whole.
That's great. I guess it's perhaps a bit unusual for community-based sexual violence support centres, which of course originated from within the women's movement, to have a dedicated program engaging men and boys in preventing gender-based violence. So yeah, could you tell us a bit about how the work you're doing came about in the first place?
I would love to, yeah. Because you're definitely correct. A lot of work like mine, a lot of kind of rape crisis centers, things of that nature, very much came about as a result of that large kind of second wave movement of feminism. SASC my organization itself started not as like an office for counseling or anything, but as a crisis phone line. So it started, strictly as a 24-hour phone line that was funded in the region so that survivors could call and have someone to talk to. And from there, the kind of demand for more support, for more, resources, it kind of kept growing as they saw what it was capable of doing for people in the community. And that continued to expand until it also reached, the idea of we need to be doing more to prevent this kind of stuff. Like, it's one thing to offer a supportive, network and like of care and support for survivors. But if we want to move towards a community where we are, eradicating sexual violence as an end goal, we need to be doing education work. And when looking at that and kind of expanding that work, a lot of the kind of preventative education work when it came to sexual violence was speaking to women and girls on like what they could do to not be harmed. And as many people have rightfully pointed out, that is not necessarily a fair approach to these kinds of conversations. If you want to have those conversations, you need to be talking to people who are capable of, preventing the harm before it starts, and also talking to the people who are statistically probably most likely to cause that harm. So the program came about in 2008. It was originally called the MARC Project, the Men Against Rape Coalition. It quickly changed to become the Male Allies Project, and continued to kind of expand with different community support into kind of what it is now through grants, through a lot of community engagement in the programs that we were doing. But yeah, the goal of it initially was really to kind of engage men in conversations and education around the nature of sexual and gender-based violence, men's roles in preventing that. And that still is very much a focus of the program, but it has now expanded as we have learned more, as we have gained more access to resources, increased kind of and bettered our pedagogical approach. It also now looks at creating spaces for men to kind of have conversations in general around our role within feminism, our role as allies, our role in challenging the kind of masculinity notions that kind of keep getting passed down onto us. Because many of the men that I've spoke to have realized that it's something that they want to do, but it's very difficult to learn how to start. And so that was kind of where our program has grown into, while keeping that core tenet of trying to challenge sexual and gender-based violence.
And what was your own sort of route into this work? Because it's not the most natural thing for men to go into, really, is it? And,
absolutely,
and
no.
What was it that led you to sort of first question expectations about masculinity?
It's always kind of funny to answer this question because I always wish that it was like some large noble calling. I mean, it definitely probably started, the roots took place just based on a lot of the women in my life as I was growing up and the role that they had in raising and shaping me and teaching me to engage with my own feelings and everything. I first came across the notion of feminism when I was in high school through Tumblr. It was definitely kind of my first foray into that idea. My then girlfriend at the time had kind of introduced me to the website, and as I grew to engage with it more, and I learned more about, back then it was, they were all just labeled social justice warriors. Now it's woke. The terminology changes so rapidly. But people on there who I was starting to realize, like, a lot of the messaging I was receiving at school from other kind of social media sites at the time about, how these people act and everything, I was like, this doesn't seem right at all, right? So much of the messaging that was on, like, YouTube at the time or anything was about, feminists getting owned and things like that. And it was always portraying them as insane and over the top and hating men. And as I grew more into the movement, as I started, associating with feminism, calling myself a feminist, I started to realize, like, that's just not true. Like, almost every feminist I have ever engaged with is so, grateful and happy to see men who are willingly taking up that work. And every time, I meet new people and I continue to enter, and be in these spaces and try to uplift, other voices. Many people are so happy to have, allies with whom they can commiserate, celebrate, build community with. And then when I entered university, the role of, going into this space, being a student leader through like positions at the university and everything like that, and then also being like a very loud male feminist kind of led me to naturally being a sort of male allyship educator. My role in a lot of those spaces was going to be talking to the other men in the space about how they can show up for, the women in their lives, talking to the men in that space about how, some of the jokes that they were maybe engaging in are harmful and things like that, while trying to keep it, very neutral. And then from there, I got a part-time, or it was a full-time, but like student summer job at the university's sexual violence prevention office. And, coupled with my background in education, which is what I went to university for, when I had moved to the Waterloo region and saw that this was, not only a center that was doing great work that aligned with what I knew, but also that there was a role specifically meant to engage men in those conversations, it was, a very natural fit.
And I guess, women were happy to see you doing the work, but at the same time, there's the issue of accountability that has to come up there as well. So, ensuring that we're genuinely supporting gender equality, not taking over, for example. And I guess being rooted in the support centre helps you with this accountability issue. And what kind of steps do you take to ensure that you are being accountable to women, or the work that you're doing is accountable to women in the women's movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, great question. And it's one that I always, if not consciously, am always trying to implement when I'm creating programs, when I am, reaching out to or being, brought into spaces. As a program, I think it is important to recognize that historically, men's spaces, and even progressive or feminist men's spaces, if left unchecked, very often slide back into a lot of kind of, reinforcement of patriarchal ideas and communications. There's been studies of this kind of historically where we see it happen. We see it happen a lot in online spaces where, they will create a space that is posited as being, a male positivity space, one where, men can go to talk about their problems and receive the support and things like that, and talk about that. I don't ever posit the Male Allies training or the programs that I'm running as, male positivity spaces. These are male allyship spaces. The fundamental goal at the end of each of these, sessions, at the end of this learning, is how can we be, better educated, better prepared to take up allyship in our day-to-day lives. It can require a little bit of, moderation, not necessarily in like trying to shut down people who come in with contradictory experiences or, thoughts, because those are a dime a dozen. It's very common to have those kinds of thoughts, and especially with, the rhetoric that is currently being pushed for a lot of men. But instead, making sure that in that space, a lot of the more kind of insidious notions of like men's spaces get challenged and checked. So the idea of, trying to, a lot of times when we're talking about, men's issues, or, we're taking that kind of bell hooks approach of, recognizing this is how patriarchy harms men. There is a lot of kind of insidious approaches of recognizing, well, it's also because, women online say, I hate men. It's because, when young boys go to school, they hear all of these programs and empowerment for women, but nothing about, men and boys and everything. And it's always a difficult conversation, but one that needs to be curbed, right? The point of these spaces is not to reinvent a way for, to blame women for the struggles that men are having, right? It is very often about, that accountability is often about re-centralizing and recognizing we're looking at a thing of systems here. We're challenging, a patriarchal notions that are bigger than the individual, and the individual contributes to that, but we really need to kind of keep our eye on the prize here. We need to bring it back to that. And so, not letting those kind of harmful quips and comments go unchecked because they seem harmless at first. They seem to be well-intentioned, but similar to, how many men bring up, male survivors of sexual violence only as often as a tool to distract from or silence conversations about, violence that women and girls face on a day-to-day basis, or queer individuals. It's important to challenge a lot of those kinds of rhetoric around like the reason men are unhappy or things like that are because of the gains that other groups have gotten, and really trying to kind of bring it back to recognizing, that the systems that are harming us, just like when we talk intersectionality and how people's oppressions are interlinked, the systems that are harming us are harming them as well. And we aren't getting anywhere by blaming individuals or pushing men's issues onto women. And then on the level of the individual, it is, a lot about challenging the notion of like men's space and feminism as, I'm always encouraging people to learn and to read and to do all of those things. But, as an individual within those spaces, being accountable isn't being up to date on theory. It's not knowing all of the buzzwords that you need to say in order to like perfectly, succinctly argue with somebody on the internet. There's a poster that hangs up in the kitchen in my office space in the city. It's right above the sink, and it says, "Real feminists do their dishes." And I think, that is something that very much embodies that kind of individual approach that I always try and talk to people about, with like accountability to feminism and the feminist movement and to the women and girls in our lives, is about, recognizing you can do all of the theory, you can do all of the learning, you can engage in those spaces, but if you are not checking your own personal behaviors, if you're not checking the ways in which you engage with the women and girls in your life, if you are perpetuating these kinds of, patriarchal notions of leaving the dishes for other people, of, not cleaning up after yourself and things like that, then the theory doesn't get anywhere, right? The action is necessary on that kind of individual level to ensure that we're not perpetuating that harm, even if we think ideologically that we're past it.
Mm. Yeah, you made me think of a conversation we had with Cynthia Enloe, who writes about militarism and foreign policy. Right. We did a great interview with her, but I remember her saying, that there's a process to this. One's always becoming a feminist, Right. And it's kind of a lifelong process and duty, I guess. So yeah, I always remember that and think that's quite an important way of putting it, really.
I like that a lot.
Well, and you mentioned, Landon, as well about the kind of the pushback that against violence prevention work with men and boys that we're witnessing at the moment. Although I think it was a good point you raised as well, that I guess the backlash isn't anything new, is it? There's always been a backlash against feminism.
Unfortunately.
Yes. But clearly, this work can be a really kind of positive and beneficial experience for men and boys, as well as, of course, for the wider community. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, what kind of impacts have you seen this work having on the men and boys that you're engaging with? Like, have any particular responses from them stuck with you?
Yeah, there's a few that always stick with me. Like, so oftentimes I find a lot of buy-in and a lot of, really altered ideas around relationships and sex when I get to like have genuine and like in-depth conversations on consent with people, right? So like I do appreciate and always love my opportunities to go in and talk to, classrooms and stuff and teach them consent and everything like that. But there's only so much nuance you can provide to, a grade 7 classroom that has 25 students in it, and I'm talking to them for 50 minutes. But when I really get into it, there's a couple moments that stand out to me. So like one was a conversation that I had with afterwards with a hockey player after doing a workshop with a team, where one of the players had said that like the way that I had phrased it had made him realize that whenever he had learned about consent beforehand, he had never seen himself as an agent of consent. That wasn't the exact word that, wording he had used, but that was what it boiled down to. Consent was always a to-do list kind of checkbox, right? Of recognizing, yes, it's important and essential to having safety and everything, but it is the thing that we do to make sure that we're good to have sex, things like that. Whereas, after the session, it made him realize like that he had been just kind of assuming in almost every case that he had been a consenting an agent of consent, that he hadn't, never really thought of it before, but that there were times where he was like, I don't know if I was super comfortable with that, but a lot of the pressure and a lot of the messaging that I received was that, like, I kind of always had to be down for it. So things like that, in a moment after a session with a man who had come back to me afterwards and said that, like, after the session on, like, consent and relationships that we had done in a training together, he had, reached back out to me, and he said that after that, him and his wife had a conversation for an hour and a half to almost 2 hours that night, and the session ended at 9 p.m. So their conversation kind of went late into the night, and that it changed things. Like, he suddenly, he realized, ways in which he had been, an adequate partner, but also a lot of ways that he could continue to show up and make things safer for her within their relationship, not in, like, a protective sense, but in a sense of, like, acknowledging, how we could engage on things together in a much more equitable way. And yeah, a lot of the feedback that really sticks with me is the people who come back or who, see me out in community, and they come up and they say, like, that talk that you gave changed the way that I did relationships from there on. Like, it helped me recognize the things that I valued. It helped me recognize, more of who I was, and the role that I could play in not only my own life, but in the lives of everyone that I have relationships with.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful, isn't it, to kind of spin it around, because I feel like consent is so often framed as it being about something men get. When it's like, well, actually, we should all be consenting, and are you always actually up for sex? Because you're probably not, right? Like, even though obviously that's the story we're told, that men are or should always be up for sex. But
yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, so while I mentioned backlash before, I guess it's impossible not to mention your neighbours in the United States with everything that's been going on there at the moment. So yeah, I mean, in what ways has the kind of Trump presidency, would you say, how has that impacted on Canadian society? Obviously, it's a very kind of masculinist, militarist, authoritarian regime over there. So yeah, how has that been impacting on Canada? I mean, it's been interesting, for example, following the kind of Mark Carney and his prime ministership. Would you say he's modelling a different kind of masculinity? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I would definitely say so. So a couple thoughts on that. One, something I wanted to bring up even beforehand. This is a fun little bit of Canadian trivia for you, but for many years under the Justin Trudeau prime ministership, a lot of, kind of more conservative-leaning individuals made their political beliefs clear with a bunch of, stickers and for cars, flags in their lawns that very politely said F Trudeau, maybe more explicitly. They were everywhere. You really couldn't travel through, any kind of populous space without seeing them. And very quickly after Justin Trudeau stepped down and Mark Carney was affirmed and then, re-elected as prime minister, the flag businesses kept it up, and now there's a plenty of F. Carney flags everywhere. But many of them seem to object to his relationship to the UK. There's always a Union Jack somewhere on those stickers and flags that are anti-Carney. So I thought that was very interesting.
Because he was the head of the Bank of England, wasn't he?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So a very kind of interesting little relationship there. So I mean, it is. As in many places, impossible to not, kind of see the effects that the Trump presidencies have had culturally in many, many ways. It shifted the narrative in the playbook, I think, for a lot of other kind of global right-wing movements and parties. And, you open the episode talking about Epstein, and the more we learn about that, the more we learn that there was, a lot going on behind the scenes of kind of collaborations there of making these kinds of plans, bear fruit. Canada has been very directly affected by that, given the policy kind of side of things. Our right-wing party the Conservative Party has shifted very hard, I think, to kind of that more populist play style. It has, affected, a lot of the rhetoric in our kind of day-to-day spaces, the way we go about these things, all very kind of similar to how it was pre-Trump, but with much more, vitriol now, a lot of hatred for the kind of populations that they scapegoat, trans individuals, immigrants, things like that. And we've seen how it affects, the political parties. So, for example, in Canada, we have something within our Charter of Rights and Freedoms called the Notwithstanding Clause. I'm unsure if you're familiar with it. It's a section that basically says that at times, usually times of great distress and things like that, provincial and the federal government can invoke, and pass legislation notwithstanding other sections of the Charters of Rights and Freedoms, notably, many of our rights and freedoms, things like, the right to not be discriminated against, the right to organize, things like that. It was, put in there in order to get some provinces on board when the charter was being created. And historically has only really been used by Quebec, usually in protest. But recently, since around 2018, many provincial conservative premiers have just been implementing it in ways of very, very kind of akin to Trump's, attempts of just being like, the rules don't apply. Right? Decorum is out the window. We can do what we want. And so there have been, in Alberta, Canada, just last year, perhaps 2024, their MP and premier had implemented that rule and basically said we're making it harder for kids to be trans. We're making it less safe for kids to be trans in schools, and we're doing it with the notwithstanding clause. So the courts can't challenge this as like discriminatory. And it has been this kind of this big thing that we just keep happening. They keep doing it in order to force employees back to work, teachers and things like that. They keep invoking this clause in order to basically be like, we're not here for legal challenges. We're just doing what we want to, which has been scary. It has been, difficult to see. Carney has been welcomed, I think, overall in Canada, I think with pretty open arms. Justin Trudeau came with a lot of baggage that, a lot of people weren't really willing to challenge. He hadn't won many people over. I think Mark Carney has, but I think, when you talk of it in that lens of masculinity, I think Carney represents more of a soft patriarchy as opposed to Trump's very kind of dominating one. Many of the criticisms of Carney's policies and everything like that from progressive spaces, hold for criticisms of much of our Liberal Party, similar to your Labour Party, things like that, where it is just a lot of that kind of same neoliberalism. It is trying to repackage a status quo, but in a very presentable way. And I think on the world stage, that sells very well. Carney has been very well received internationally. The World Economic Forum that happened a few weeks ago, as of the recording of this, where he spoke and he had a speech that was very well received, and then Trump came on the next day and like insulted him for it and said that we really want Greenland, and just kind of ignoring a lot of the premises of what was going on. So I think Trump represents this very kind of very dominating patriarchy, right? A kind of masculinity that exudes, that doesn't necessarily exude power, but rather is implicit in saying like, of course we have power, right? That's who we are, and when we wouldn't accept anything else, and so we're going to use it to get our way. Carney's, patriarchy still holds on to a lot of that kind of notion of power, but it doesn't do so with the kind of the language of domination. It does it in a much more kind of polite way, which I find, is a common issue with, again, a lot of kind of men's groups, right? A lot of people who try to speak to, men's issues will say, here's the key to fixing modern masculinity. And the solutions very often are just kind of rebuilding a lot of patriarchal ideals, but in, it repackaged with a nice bow on top. That is a problem that we kind of keep running into, because I don't think it motivates anyone to try to challenge things if you just try to keep sticking to that status quo.
So a key area of focus for you is sport, I think, Landon, particularly ice hockey. That we know that's hugely popular in Canada, and you said earlier you've delivered work with Hockey Canada and the Ontario Hockey League. I think, amongst others. Could you tell us a bit more about this work, and why is sport such an important institution to engage with in your view?
So, I mean, I think sport is so important because for very many individuals, sport is kind of one of the most direct ways in which they engage in their community. Hockey is Canadian culture. I frequently joke about this, but in the kind of last election that we had to determine prime minister of the country and everything, there was a debate between party leaders that was rescheduled because it coincided with a hockey game. It just is that big of a thing here for so many people. And so talking to hockey players, getting in on that culture is kind of two-pronged. One, it gets to people where they can access it. Two, the culture has some issues that we specifically want to address. Hockey culture, in particular, takes a lot of very direct influence from some more of the kind of harmful masculine ideas. It is very much a space where violence is celebrated. I remember growing up as a child and the amount of parents that were protesting and getting actually upset because they raised the age 2 years in which fighting was allowed on the ice. So suddenly they were actually 12-year-olds can't fight each other on the ice anymore. You have to be 14 to do that. And they were fully willing to protest. It was such an kind of an integral part of the sport for them. And so it was, when we continued to see a lot of kind of harm come out of these spaces for, the players themselves, but then also for people who are interacting with them, it became, very apparent that this was a space we needed to talk to, right? Whether it was about consent or now more so, focused on untying a lot of those notions of masculinity from, self-worth and things like that. We see these kind of big news stories pop up about the violence that can sometimes happen in these spaces. And for a lot of people, that hits very close to home. They know players who, make it to that level. They hung out with guys who were very much like that. Everyone, when you enter a school, you find out very quickly who the hockey players are, whether it's, by their dress, by the way that other people refer to them, things like that. And because they have that kind of cultural, kind of social capital, that, speaking to them helps engage not only the issues apparent in that space, but then also helps to kind of create that ripple effect that we so often hope happens regarding consent and violence prevention education, right? I speak to this small group of people, it gets through to 50% of them, if I'm, being optimistic, but then they take it and it spreads out in their circles. And those kind of conversations keep happening. So we look to, athletics and everything like that to say this is a good space to have these conversations because, it challenges a lot of direct issues with kind of masculinity as these young people are experiencing it. And also, hopefully has that kind of cultural, widespread effect.
And it's more than just sort of, whether you can be violent at 12 or 14, isn't it? It's like, what's talked about in the locker room. It's about the culture of silence. It's about, the kind of conversations you hear with normalized aggression and domination. It's that sort of stuff as well, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. So I joined this organization. I joined SASC in the summer of 2022. And that was the summer where the Hockey Canada trial, kind of that news broke. Particularly the news that broke at that time wasn't about, the violent, harm that had occurred. That was something that was known about a couple years prior, but then didn't necessarily go anywhere. What was discovered in 2022 was that Hockey Canada as an organization had been using player registration fees to help create hush funds to pay out to survivors of sexual violence that experienced violence at the hands of their players and other people within that kind of under their purview. And, in doing so, basically said, if you are engaged in Hockey Canada in any way, which many, many people are, right? A lot of the fees that players have and things like that go to Hockey Canada. It's a massive organization. You are in some way kind of contributing to that culture of silence. You are contributing to the fact that not only is it expected that these players will cause this harm, but they've already taken, countermeasures against word getting out to protect their own name. And so that was when, it was shortly after that news story broke that Hockey Canada had reached out to us to say, hey, would it be possible to get you to train, many of our players and also many of our staff? And they had done so because for the past 6 years at the time, we had been involved in running something called the OHL Onside program. So the OHL is our Ontario Hockey League. It's very high level hockey. Many players, they're young when they're in the OHL, so they take players from 15 to around 22, and many players, in that space, then it's probably the place to go to if you're trying to get scouted to go to the NHL kind of deal. So this is, it's very high level hockey. These are very, very, adept players. And we had made this partnership with them to run this training for 2 hours with all the teams, as much as we could, hopefully once per year, on basically just trying to get out to them and talk to them about consent, about masculinity, about these kinds of things, and how they see it, how they are affected by it in their roles as hockey players, and then what they can do about, the kinds of things that get brought up around them, that they are just kind of subject to in association with, a lot of the harms happening in high level hockey. But that had kind of paved the ground for Hockey Canada to reach out to us to kind of look for that kind of training. We did that in collaboration with the Calgary Sexual Assault Center. And, since then, in 2023, we had kind of stopped directly training them. I couldn't tell you where they are, receiving that training now. Hopefully they still are, and they still view it as a priority. But, in that whole kind of debacle, it kind of became abundantly clear there's something about hockey culture that needs to change. There's something about that kind of sports culture and how closely tied it is to a lot of notions of masculinity and things like that, that is harming people and that we want to try to, prevent.
I think, I don't think you mentioned it specifically, but you're alluding also to quite a significant case, which people in Canada will know about, but others outside Canada may not remember. So, as I understand it, 5 members of the national junior team were accused of sexually assaulting a woman in London, Ontario in about 2018, but they were acquitted, and I think they've been reinstated recently into the league. Is that right?
They have, yeah. So many of them, of the 5 players, I know of one who currently plays in the NHL. I believe one other might have also gotten drafted, but isn't, as prominent of a role. But everyone else had been, reinstated. They had been cleared that they could indeed go and continue to, play at this high level if they so choose, if they get drafted, things like that. Yeah, that was a difficult time. It was very, very hard. London is very close to our center. We work very closely with some of the centers that do similar work in London. One of the centers of which worked very closely with the survivor, EM. And, that case was difficult. It brought up a lot of to us at least, it brought up a lot of good, points around some of the issues that surround consent education as it is practiced in many ways, right? If consent education is done and provided to people, but it is done, as we talked about earlier, and kind of portrayed in this way of consent is something men get from women, then that leads to situations where in deeply uncomfortable situations, you're taking video recordings of people to try to get their consent, right, on camera, right? We always make it very clear in our sessions, video consent in regards to sexual acts doesn't really matter, because the whole point of consent, if it's going to be genuine and authentic, is that you can take it back at any time. So if I can take it back at any time during the action, what is the point of you taking that video beforehand? And if you're taking it afterwards, that doesn't really mean anything either, because I don't know if you know this exact detail. In one of the consent videos that was submitted as evidence in that trial, the video begins with the player who's taking the video saying, "Say it." You can hear at the beginning of the video, right, that it comes across at least, to me and to many of the people in this line of work, as something that was, very scripted, as something that they were kind of forcing themselves to get from the survivor, because in doing so, they figured it would help clear their names, and it did, right? But it also, I think, points us in this direction of like, that's an inadequate way to get consent, but it also ignores all of the ways in which safety needs to be brought into these conversations, right? Consent is this kind of very, in many ways, can be this very kind of nuanced thing that cannot, be boiled down to like, did they say yes or no? It needs to be more than that, right? I often will say in workshops that like, if your consent isn't coupled with compassion and empathy for the person with whom you're trying to gain that consent for, I don't know if your motives for getting it are perfectly clear. So
it's really,
it was a difficult trial.
Yeah, I was reading about the trial, and really shocking, really, how it seemed like the victim survivor was the one basically on trial, and not the man by the judge.
Yes,
like really shocking comment.
Cross-examined 5 times.
Just awful. And unfortunately, it's very relatable for many different countries as well, isn't it? I think Ireland, the UK, like we've seen many cases like this in recent years, which is awful. But yeah, on a more positive note, something we couldn't help but ask you about, especially because we're talking about ice hockey, was the recent Canadian TV series Heated Rivalry. So if people aren't familiar with it, it tells the fictional story of two kind of superstar hockey players, Shane Hollander and Ilya Rozanov, who maintain a kind of secret, kind of long-term romantic relationship while playing for rival teams. And the show's become incredibly popular worldwide. I've seen it. I don't know if you've seen it, Sandy. I'm a huge fan of it myself. And it's been praised, among other things, for its kind of opening up of kind of rigid, restrictive masculine norms, like its display of kind of love and intimacy among men, its fearlessness in depicting kind of queer sexuality on screen. So have you seen it, Landon? And if so, what did you make of it? What did you make of its kind of portrayal of masculinity?
Yeah, so I have not seen it all. I've recently I finished episode 4. I love it. I think it's a great show, and I've learned from many of my colleagues and friends that by not having seen episodes 5 and 6, I'm doing myself a great disservice. So I am excited to continue to. I'm excited to continue that. But from everything that I've heard, it has been everywhere here. It has been, it is one of those things where there was a point where I was like, do I need to watch it? Because I feel like I've picked up pretty much everything. I've seen, many different shots on videos, on Reels and TikToks and things like that. I've seen it analyzed to death. It is a phenomenal show. I'm very grateful for it because I do think it does. I do think it does a great service to kind of conversations around masculinity, particularly within spaces where masculinity is so rigidly defined, like in kind of hockey, and it does it in a way that I think really speaks to many people. Right? It has a very universal appeal, a much more universal appeal than a show about two kind of closeted queer hockey lovers, one might think that a show like that would have. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Stephen, in recognizing it approaches masculinity in this very kind of, in a way that makes it feel safe. All of the masculinity that is going on in the show is never weaponized at, necessarily one another, particularly within, the kind of close and intimate relationships that are built between men in the show. I do think there is, a really interesting conversation to be had there about the role of masculinity within these two kinds of players' lives. Like, these are men, Shane Hollander, Ilya Rozanov, these are men who, for all intents and purposes, are on top of the world when it comes to like being a man's man. Right? They are professional hockey players. Not only are they professional hockey players, they are star hockey players. They are, they're rookies of the year. They are MVP winners. They are, one of them is essentially a Stanley Cup winner, things like that. And so much of it, the pressures and everything kind of, get built onto them. If you view them just as like through the lens of like, men get rewarded for performing masculinity, you would think then that these men have everything. And the show does a very good job of explaining how, I think it's their relationships and things like that are a great portrayal of what masculinity could be. It is this feeling of, safeness. It is that kind of connection. It can be all of those things, while also doing a great job of portraying how patriarchy and masculinity harms and limits men in real life. One of the main characters, Ilya Rozanov, he is, again, he is buff, he is muscular, he's a professional athlete, he's hot and he's desirable and he's all of these things, and he's dominant like we're told men should be. And every interaction we have of him with his father is him scared, right? His father is this, very high kind of like ranking, Russian official who, no matter what success he achieves, it is never good enough, no matter what, right? It kind of is a great portrayal of the ways in which, patriarchal masculinity and the kind of the man box notion sets us up for failure. It's never enough. You have to constantly keep striving for more, because the second you stop striving for more, that's when you start to fall short of the expectations that the culture has for you. And so, despite displaying masculinity in this very kind of, tender and loving way, which I think for many people is such a great appeal of the show, where they get to see, this is what the men in my life could be capable of. They could be, they can and should be capable of this tenderness, of this communication, of this kind of love. Very often they aren't. And the reasons why are those kinds of, social limits that are put on them in regards to, the way that, again, to reference Bell Hooks again, how she refers to the first victim of patriarchy's, men's self-mutilation, like emotional self-mutilation. And how we see that here, right? And how it takes a very long time for these men to open up to each other, right? The relationship builds over the course of like 6 or 8 years. And in that entire time, for quite a while, it's purely sexual. And it is only after, a little bit, when they finally will give way to the fact that I do have feelings for this person, that is when, those things can really get analyzed. There's some really great analyses of this. I saw one really great video by a TikTok user by the name of Hannabella, where she talked about like why she was so obsessed with this show and how, it portrayed romance on an even playing field without the impact of gender and the kind of patriarchal expectations of who would be the desirer and who would be the desired, who is, the operator of desire and who is the object and subject of it. So, there's so many great kind of analyses to come out of it, but I think it has done, a wonderful job in breaking down some of those expectations of what men can and should be.
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole episode just discussing it.
Probably. It's wonderful.
I mean, one thing I do think is very clever is, like, by focusing on ice hockey and, as you said, with characters who are very hegemonically masculine, maybe it offers a route in for men to pay an interest in it when, as you said, men might not usually watch maybe a romantic, especially a queer romance TV show. And actually, there is a piece which has been written by Professor Stephen Roberts, who we interviewed recently on the podcast, and he talks about how in Australia, actually, the show has been watched and loved by many young men as well as, young women and queer people. I mean, do you think that's something which has been happening in Canada? What would you say the show has had an impact in that positive way on Canadian society at all?
I think so. So one thing I will say, I think it has done wonders for much of our faith in Canadian television. That has always, for many young Canadian individuals, been a sore spot, and so it has been nice to see a real glowing example of it come out to this kind of universal acclaim. But additionally, I think, it has been received with very open arms. In fact, the creator of the show, Jacob Tierney, is also involved in a couple of other shows that are very much very well received kind of Canadian classics in a sense. There's two of them. They're Letterkenny and Shoresy. They also both kind of focus on, there's ice hockey is very prominent in Shoresy, less so in Letterkenny. Both of them are very kind of Canadian, but both of them, I think, have very interesting things to say about masculinity and the ways in which these characters kind of, show up. But it has been extraordinarily well received. I will say most of my work and peer group has been women, and I have received an overwhelming response from them in regards to the show and how much they love and adore it. But in the cases where I have been speaking to men about it who have seen it, it's very, very a very similar story. The show is being kind of received, I think, because it is not necessarily so universal. This is not an experience that many people are going to be particularly familiar with, but the ways in which, the challenges of these people who seem like they should be untouchable, right? Particularly for a lot of young men, where they see, this whole thing of, messaging around masculinity is, you have to be tough and you can't have problems and all of these things just need to be ignored. And, all of these kinds of very consistent messages that we've received, it shows, suddenly all of these people who are checking all of the boxes and still struggle, right? The struggle isn't necessarily to do with their, inherent masculinity or their self-worth. It is instead about the boundaries that we put on men in the ways in which they are able to show and receive love. And in doing so, I think, a lot of the men that I have talked to and engaged with, see that as hopeful. They see it as a way to kind of think moving forward of the ways in which these things can be communicated, these things can be achieved, and that they can be done in a way that doesn't have to do with the kind of power dynamics that romance so often demands of like its lead subjects. It can be done instead in a way that is equitable. It can be done instead in a way that, can work collaboratively only once you get past the barriers of the expectations of a culture that tells you that you don't deserve it.
So, I think as of yet, no active NHL players have ever come out as gay, which is also the same in soccer in the UK, for example, or Australian football here in Australia. So you might, hopefully, one day soon, some, men might feel able to actually do that.
Yes.
And, yeah.
We did an event through my work just a couple of years ago, actually speaking with Brock McGillis, who is a former NHL player who has since come out. But he spoke, to a very similar situation. It was impossible, right, for him at that time. It just wasn't. Even when he spoke at that event, he spoke even afterwards when he had like left that kind of limelight, when he was coaching hockey, when he was doing things like that. It wasn't easy. He tells this anecdote of, a lot of the young boys coming in that he's, speaking to and training and everything, and being, open about the fact that, they know that he's gay, and him, like the panic that overtakes him in that space of like, that's not supposed to be known here. And then the relief that comes from a lot of these young players being like, it's, so cool that you're here. Thanks for doing what you do, after all of that. But it is, it is still very pervasive. Unfortunately, it is a very kind of hegemonic space that is, causes a lot of harm.
Well, full disclosure, I haven't actually seen this show yet, but listening to you two, I clearly have to.
And one thing I will say about it, just as a heads up, Sandy, that is indeed, hockey players do indeed have butts like that. Skating is really, yeah.
Well, the only two pennyworth I was going to throw in was that there was that film, US film, Brokeback Mountain, wasn't there? Which was about two cowboys in a loving relationship. Right. So maybe each country has to find its own way of presenting, what's going on with masculinity.
Yeah.
Huh?
Culturally specific.
Yeah. We'll have to have a show in the UK about rugby players or cricketers or something like that.
In a sense, I think for a lot of young folks, Heartstopper fills that space well. In a way, I can't say how well it has been received, universally. I think a lot of people maybe criticize it for being, too woke and inclusive, and bringing in, all of these, other people. I think from what I have seen, I thought it did a great job of portraying a lot of those things, particularly amongst a young, rugby player who is, struggling with these things and the kind of cultural pressures of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're probably coming to a conclusion now, but how do you feel about the future of the work that you do in Canada? Do you feel optimistic about the way you're going?
I do. I think that, I would feel bad, I think, for anybody who's trying to do this work and is trying to do this activism who doesn't feel hopeful. I think it's almost a demand of the kind of doing this work that you can, at times it doesn't feel great. There are many setbacks. There are many challenges that we will experience. But I do feel hopeful, right? I do, when I go in and I speak to, groups of young men, and I see how eager they are to have these conversations because they realize they might not get a space like this again. They might not have a chance to ask these questions, at least not in a space where they can kind of trust the answers that they're given. Or, they can't take these questions to the internet because who knows, where that might lead them. Questions about dating, questions about sex, questions about all these things. They are eager to have these conversations. And when you respond to that with earnestness, and when you respond to it and you say, these are good questions, it's totally fair that you have them, the relief that these young men feel, the fact that they feel like not alone in the world, but rather the fact that they feel like they can be heard and that they can share things, and that lo and behold, it didn't hurt them, right? We set up expectations of a judgment-free space, and they find, hey, I can share these things and not be judged. I can extend that to the other men in my lives as well. You can't help but feel hopeful.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be able to end a conversation about such a difficult subject on a hopeful note. So thanks so much for your time and for talking
Thank
to us.
you. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been such a pleasure to meet you and to talk with you and hear about the great work you're doing, Landon, which gives us, I suppose, to know about the amazing work going on around the world. So yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it's so nice to know how united we can be in that front.
Totally. Thank you. Well, Sandy, as we discussed in our last episode, in the spirit of the podcast becoming a bit more kind of advocacy-oriented, I wanted to start off this conclusion just by mentioning that the End Violence Against Women Coalition in the UK have recently produced a messaging guide to help people talk about the ways in which violence against women is being kind of weaponized for kind of racist, anti-immigration agendas, and to help us all play a part in kind of shifting the narrative away from kind of scapegoating migrants for issues like violence against women, which are, of course, actually, problems across the whole of society, as our discussion illustrated. But yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes in case that's of interest to people. But what did you, Sandy, make of the conversation we had today?
Yeah, it was fascinating to hear all about Canada, actually, because, we have a sort of headline impression of how Canada is. But there's clearly a lot more, going on below the surface. I found that really fascinating, and I have been to Canada once, but I don't know it well enough, really. And certainly what Landon was saying was just very interesting on that level. But I wanted to pick up actually on the notion of consent that he mentioned several times. And I was thinking whilst he was talking about the talk that I went to by Manon Garcia, she was saying that, there's a difference between consent and good sex, really, and that, consent is often on the basis of person A, the man, almost always, doing something to person B, the woman, and she was saying that really we should move from a consent model to a consensus-based model where sex is entered into jointly. It's a conversation. It's joyous and so on. I mean, I don't know quite what that looks like on the ground. For people doing the work like Landon is. But I think it's quite interesting to interrogate that word consent and what it actually means in practice. And it's obviously more than, holding your phone and saying, say it. Exactly. That's completely not consent. Exactly. So anyway, I was interested by that, and I think there's quite an in-depth conversation one can have about consent and what it actually means.
Yeah, because it's quite a legalistic transactional term, isn't it? Which doesn't really apply very well to human relationships, because I guess sex really is about ongoing open communication and being intimate and being vulnerable with somebody, isn't it? And that means being able to listen and not just to verbal what somebody's saying, but also how their body's communicating and things like that. And I guess these kinds of skills they're not necessarily things that we are actually teaching boys and men from a young age, are they? Really, that kind of communication and being vulnerable, as we've discussed on many other episodes. And also, just another thing I wanted to mention as well, because I could talk about Heated Rivalry all day. I can highly recommend it to anybody, and I personally loved it. But one issue I did have with it if I was being critical, was just thinking about our previous episode with Brendan Goff. You know, the pressure on men to be lean, to be muscular and so on, pressures on body image. And I do think the show might perpetuate that, because pretty much all of the main characters, obviously they are ice hockey players, but, you know, they have these incredibly, you know, muscular, impressive physiques. And I just wonder, you know, what kind of pressure is media like that putting on, you know, young men to feel like they have to have those kind of bodies? That might not be so healthy. But otherwise, I did think the show was excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've got the point, Steve. But it does actually raise the question about what about those boys and men who are not into hockey?
Well, absolutely, yeah. You
know,
totally.
of which there must be some, at least.
Yeah.
You know, what's being offered to them, and how is masculinity for them. And, it reminds me of the debates in the UK about the dominance of football.
Absolutely,
that to be recognised as a boy, young man, you got to be good at football, you've got to be interested in football, and if you're not, you're somehow, apart, totally. you're lesser.
Yeah.
I imagine there's a similar sort of debate, and experience in Canada for some.
Yeah.
So,
well, again, thinking back to the episode with Brendan, clearly our conversation with Landon shows that sport can be a really important area to be doing violence prevention work, but it shows we need this work across society, because clearly that's only going to reach some men and boys, and then there's lots of other spaces where we need to be engaging with them as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Were you thinking as well about that truckers' protest in Canada?
Oh yeah. We did touch on that briefly, but not in the podcast. And I think this was going back to about 2022, and there was a sort of whole freedom convoy. And this was a group of truckers who didn't want to be vaccinated against COVID. But beyond the issue, there's the whole thing about the masculinity of truckers, really.
Yeah.
They're up there in their cabs, they're dominating the other traffic, the other drivers. They're independent, they're on the road, they're living this sort of free lifestyle.
Yeah.
Maybe with tachometers it's not as free as it used to be, but there is something about that sort of masculinity as well.
Yeah, well, and just that idea of freedom, right? You see it popping up again and again in different kinds of, I suppose, quite right-wing political movements, don't you? And I think it's quite a masculinized notion of freedom, isn't it? Is being able to do whatever you want, unconstrained, and having the power over the world, I suppose, to have that freedom. It's quite interesting. But I guess we should probably draw things to a close again, shouldn't we, Sandy, for this episode? But thank you so much, everybody, for listening, as always, to the podcast. Please do leave a review if that's something you haven't already done on the podcast platform that you may listen to us on, as it helps to bring attention to the podcast. And we'll be back with another episode soon. Contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you have questions or comments, and take care.
Yeah, and I've clearly got to go and watch Heated Rivalry,
You should,
so
yes.
I'll go and do that.
Enjoy. I'm sure you
Bye
will
for
enjoy.
now.